So you've probably heard a comment about somebody having eaten lead paint chips as a kid. More recently, you may have also heard a young person refer to somebody older as having a lead paint stare. Lead paint is frequently cited as the highest cause of lead poisoning in children, even today. I've spent the last few days combing through scientific articles, research articles, and historical advertisements to be able to paint the clearest picture of what lead paint is and why it's dangerous. So, today I'd like to tell you a little bit about why lead paint was so widespread, why it was dangerous, its decline in the US, and current day lead poisoning prevention. So, to understand lead paint, it's helpful to understand why it was so widespread in the first place. You had the color. Lead compounds could be used to make paint in many different colors. The most common one was white lead for use in home interiors and exteriors. There was also performance. Lead paint performed very well. It went on and it dried quickly. It was very durable, so you could use it in high friction applications, like in windowsills. And then there is marketing and lobbying by trade associations was another factor. They were getting reports of the dangers of lead paint, but through effective marketing and lobbying, they were able to keep it on the market. I can't go into that too much here, but their attitude is best summed up by this quote. The reports started coming out in the 19 teens and 1920s about lead poisoning of children was of great concern to the Lead Industries Association because it could, of course, affect sales. This is a quote from Gerald Markowitz. He's a history professor and he's written numerous books and articles about lead poisoning and public health. As the use of lead paint became more widespread, so did its dangers. There was the issue of ingestion. Children could get lead poisoning from eating paint chips, from deteriorating paint. But there was also the issue of lead dust contamination. As the paint aged, it would flake off and create dust, and this could lead to unknowingly inhaling or ingesting lead dust. Now, the symptoms of lead poisoning are cognitive issues, development issues, lowered IQ, and symptoms of learning disabilities such as attention deficit disorder. There are more, but those are some notable ones. According to the CDC, there is no level of lead exposure that is considered to be without harmful effects. And it was these dangers that would ultimately lead to lead paint's downfall. The use of lead paint was banned in 1978. And along with other restrictions on other lead products in the years following, lead exposure levels drastically declined. According to an article in the National Library of Medicine by experts David E. Jacobs and Mary Jean Brown, most children had a blood lead level above 10 micrograms per deciliter in the 1970s. And if you look at today, the level of concern for blood lead levels is 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. And this is based off of current lead exposure levels, and that number is meant to represent children who have more elevated lead levels than 97.5% of children. And so that's a lot of numbers, but what that means is that lead exposure is a fraction of what it was at the time that lead paint was banned. But as we've discussed, no amount of lead exposure is safe. It's worth knowing the steps that you can take to prevent lead exposure in children today. The first step is to identify sources of lead contamination. This is most commonly houses built before 1978. You can get them tested for lead paint, and if you discover lead paint, you can either encapsulate it or remove it entirely. This is especially a risk if the paint is deteriorating. Another risk is antique or imported toys. If a toy made in the US is old enough, it could have been painted with lead paint, and if it's imported, it could be from a country where lead regulations are more relaxed. And the most important step is research. The content of this speech only covers lead paint. There are other sources of lead contamination that are worth knowing. So to summarize, lead paint was a historically widespread paint that caused health issues in children, leading to its eventual ban. And actions taken since the ban have drastically reduced lead exposure levels in children today. The conversation about lead poisoning can be very anxiety producing. However, I think the most important thing to take away is that lead exposure is preventable. Those older generations that are sometimes mocked for their lead exposure levels as children put in the effort to make sure that the same thing would not happen to future generations. Thank you very much for coming to the speech. If you have any questions, now would be the time to ask. All right.